Who do you have here again? Kimberly, what's your name?
Shanice.
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 Yes.
How did I say Shanice before? It's a Shanice. All right. So I'm now going to bank with your names, but I don't know all of your names from this group, except that I shall see you on the screen. So there's a few of you out there. Let's see now. We have Anastasia, we have Jamila, we have Jocelyn, we have Shay, we have Chanel. We have the science group. Anybody from mathematics? Only science you have here?
Right, I was only conversing with the science group this morning.
So the math group is probably not aware that we're here. So have they been here before? Then I'm here now. All right. Let's just take from there. Okay. We want to talk a bit then about assessment alternatives and how it is that we address them. And there's a notion in assessment that we use, a phrase, concept, fitness for purpose. The whole idea being that whatever it is that you're going to be using, it must fit the purpose. And alongside that, we are moving away from the notion of one size fits all. So we have looked, generally speaking now, at assessment. We have looked at a number of terms. We have clarified some of these terms. And I'm going to, fear not, I'm going to allow us to have a short discussion so we can clear us where I'm going. And we're going to look at what are the possibilities for assessments today. Set you up nicely for Dr. coming back. So what we want to do, let's do a slideshow. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And to speak briefly about some of the trends in assessment. Now, this is an important way to segue because it allows us to understand why we are doing what we're doing. For those persons who are here in Jamaica, we are at this point doing some heavy-duty training, I understand, in the summer for teachers who are going to be implementing the National Standards Curriculum come September. And so what we have here is constantly various curricula are being changed. And one of the reasons for the changes is what you have on this slide, that there are various trends that have taken place over the years in assessment, and these are some of the trends. And because we have these trends, we have a different approach to assessment continuity. So you have greater emphasis on formative assessment. That's what do I mean? When we say there's a greater emphasis, it suggests that prior to now, or certainly this season of teaching and learning, there was not this strong emphasis. But there's a greater emphasis on formative assessment. By formative assessment, what do I mean?
Continuous assessment.
Continuous assessment. No. What it means, I know you should know what that means. Formative assessment and continuous assessment are not the same. Though formative assessment is continuous, it doesn't mean that it's continuous assessment. Two different things. All right, so we're going to get the jargon right. Continuous assessment could also be summative. Doesn't have to be formative. All right? So when we say we have continuous assessment, it means that it's ongoing. But it could be ongoing summative assessment, meaning at each point in, at the end of a unit or whatever the units are, you have a unit test. But formative assessment,
In class.
no, not just in class. There's something behind formative. There's a purpose behind formative. And that is what is key. Don't miss the purpose. The purpose
To monitor.
is to monitor. Excellent. Who was I hearing from just now? What's that?
Jocelyn.
Jocelyn. Excellent.
So Jocelyn.
And it's very important that we don't miss that. That the purpose is what makes it formative. Not the frequency, okay? But it is to monitor learning. Whereas summative is to report on learning. It's to give you, is to provide information that says, here is what has taken place. So there's a greater emphasis on formative assessment. And that's because there's a greater emphasis on learning. Learning has now taken center stage in classroom interactions. Okay? As well as there's a greater emphasis on continuous assessment and not just one shot. So there's a time when you could go through an entire school year and you might have at the end of the term a big exam. Okay? That's not the case now. The expectation is that teachers will monitor students' learning along the way, ongoing, it's continuous. Now, there is a notion then of formative assessment, which is usually what happens in the classroom context. But you could also have continuous assessment that is more or less high stake. So for example, in your schools, you are required during the term, I'm sure, to produce at least 3 different points where you have a grade for the students that you're teaching. Some schools call them monthly tests or monthly assessment. Some have 6-week tests. Some have unit tests. They call them by different names. But that's for monitoring purposes as well, but it's a different kind of monitoring. And that's the continuous assessment. Normally, those assessment activities are done at the end of 6 weeks or the end of a month and continue throughout. Normally, those assessment activities are recorded on some grade sheet. It goes on the student's record. And the students, perhaps at the end of the year, these are the grades that are used to factor how the student has performed over the course of the semester or term. Am I right? That's your experience? Or am I making this up?
We're not teachers.
You're not teachers. All right. Those of you who are teachers out there in
Correct.
cyberspace,
Yes, that's our experience.
that's correct. Yeah, that's how it goes. All right. So that's generally then the difference between continuous and formative assessment. Now here's a question I'm going to ask you. Listen very carefully. I'm going to make a statement, and you're going to tell me whether or not my statement is correct. Here's a statement. The school-based assessment is being treated primarily as continuous assessment. However, the expectation is that it should be viewed as formative assessment. You got that? School-based assessment is primarily treated as continuous assessment. However, the expectation is that it should be treated as formative assessment. What am I saying? School-based assessment is primarily regarded or treated as continuous assessment, and sometimes it's even treated as summative assessment. One could add that. However, the expectation is that it should be formative assessment. I want you to comment on what I'm saying. I want you to simplify it. I want you to demystify it. I want you to tell me what I'm saying in everyday language that you could use now to a parent.
Well, the school-based assessment is continuous in the sense that we do it on a regular basis every week. Sometimes, we have to do it for 4th form, 5th form. And it is summative in the sense that at the end of the 2-year period, we have to give them a grade. They get a grade that goes towards their CXC grade. the final grade. However, it should be formative because it helps us, the teachers, to know how the students are, how they are learning throughout the process.
All right. So then, who was this?
That's Jamila.
Jamila. All right. Jamila, that's a good take on it. The expectation is that the school-based assessment is really supposed to be used to monitor students' progress. And the whole idea behind that is that classroom teachers are best poised to help students to improve. So the whole idea is to help students to improve. However, those grades come together to be a part of the student's summative assessment, meaning that the school-based assessment contributes, I think, 20% towards their final CSEC grade. All right? Now, the expectation, though, is that it should be formative in its purpose, but continuous in how it is given, of course, because it's not one shot, but it's done over the period of 2 years, as you have said, Jamil. One of the weaknesses that we have found in the school-based assessment is that many times teachers miss the formative purpose for the school-based assessment. They miss it. And so, even though the students actually do the practical activities in the days of science, they do these activities, the students don't benefit from feedback. Why? Because teachers wait until the very end of the term, or perhaps even sometimes the year, before they grade the assessment. So, I'm trying to link now what you have been learning with some of the concepts that you are applying it to what you're doing. Okay? Is that clear? Nobody understands? Kimberly and Shanice?
Yes, it is. And I agree.
Yes, it is.
All right, and you agree. I hope you're not guilty. Anybody wants to confess?
No, we're not guilty.
Why? Why do you say you're not guilty, Justin?
Because that is something that I practice, continuous and formative assessment. Even where I teach, I normally give students more assessment than required. And the first one is really to evaluate and to see where they're at and to see where to take them from. So I do agree.
I would say I am guilty somewhat because the time frame which we have to mark SBAs. So I'd say that CXC is at fault for this because it's forcing us to always be hurrying in a rush to mark these SBAs, and the children probably won't be learning as we want them to be.
Okay, Camila, thanks for the honesty. And I don't think you're unique in that situation. I think a number of teachers fall into that trap. Sometimes because they don't plan properly. Sometimes it's inexperience. Sometimes it is a matter that really it's just too much. But when we do the next course, we perhaps will look at some of the ways in which we can help teachers to make this work a little better. Anybody else commenting? All right, fine. Now, the other point being made on the slide here is that there's a greater use of criterion reference assessments over, let's say, non-referencing, over non-reference assessments. And pretty much what this is saying is that we are now using assessment activities where we are asking students to aim for and satisfy a certain standard. So we're asking students to tell us what they know, and we're judging students on the basis of what they know, okay, and not what they don't know. So we set some standards. Students are required to reach these standards if they're going to proceed to move on. That is because we recognize that at the level of the classroom, I shouldn't say we recognize this, I'm saying as if we never recognized before. But what is happening is that the research is pointing to the fact, let's put it that way, that the classroom teacher has a significant role to play in how much students learn and how well they do. And that is primarily informed by how assessment is conducted. And so what we want teachers to be able to do is to set assessment activities that will enable students to demonstrate how much they know, what they know. Have I reached that standard? If I want my students to be able to move on from grade 7 to grade 8 in sciences, what are the minimum requirements for them to be able to move on? Is it just a letter grade that they must get a B or an A? Or what does the B or the A mean? Okay? If they get 70, but 70, how does 70 translate to competence? And that's what we're talking about here. So when we talk about criteria and reference, we're moving beyond just having a grade. We're saying, what are the criteria? What is it that we're using as our marker? Now, this has implications for the kinds of assessment activities that we set. What we're saying then is, if I'm going to be suggesting that these students are competent to do, let's say, CSEC chemistry, what are the fundamental concept, skills, ideas that they must master before I get it into fourth form? And so when we look at assessment like that, it will then prompt us to think more carefully about what are the criteria we're asking students to master. And so this is what we're going to use this now as the basis for what we're going to be looking at in the session today. That we're forced to think about what are these criteria we're asking students to master. Okay? There's a greater emphasis on the learning process and less on recall of content. And by learning process, what we're saying is that we want to find out what's going on up here. What's the cognitive activities taking place inside here? How are students thinking about what we're saying? And not just what they remember. But what does it mean? And so it means, if that's what we're thinking, then we have to ask students the kinds of questions that will elicit thinking, that will have them tell us how they process information. So that's the implication. And finally, there's a greater recognition that skills and personal and social development, meaning that it's not just about what the student can recall, but even about the person, who is this person becoming, and therefore we're not just dealing with the content per se, but how do you use this content? How do you apply it? How do you make it come alive in the sense that you want students to be able to make decisions about, let's say, the environment, about how they use, resources, how they make decisions based on what they learn. So based on that, you create the kind of assessment activities that enable and allow them to do this. All right? So that's a trend. Those are the trends. And because of these trends, all right. We have some practice, some changes. So let's talk a bit now about what we mean by large-scale assessment. We talked about this in our a series of reminders now in terms of what these are. Now, when we think of large-scale assessment, thinking about what you would get on your CSEC examination, like for example, or your GSAT, or your CAPE, or your grade 4 literacy, or your SAT and GNAT. Those are large-scale exams that they function to maintain standards. So you want to see how various students compare from year to year, from school to school, from country to country. That's your large-scale exams. Okay? Normally, these examinations do not set the entire, they don't address the full curriculum, but it's a sample. Because you really can't assess the full curriculum in one examination. So it's sample, okay? It's done by, like I said, a large segment of the population usually infrequently, and there's much secrecy. So for example, when the CXC had an examination leak a couple of years ago, they had to revamp, they had to abandon that exam. They had to redo, send another paper. When these exams are sent, they are sent on serious security measures are taken. The examiner, you will notice, remember, when you go to the examiner takes the envelope like this and takes the scissors to show that this is just being opened, and so the students don't feel that there has been some sort of leak. High-stakes exams are administered like that. Normally, feedback is not immediate, but delayed, and typically, you normally use traditional assessment. Normally, pencil and paper, which will involve primarily your multiple choice and perhaps your essay items. So that's high stakes. And usually because they are implemented, large population, widely distributed, you have to find ways that are cost effective. And hence, that's what we have, high stakes. We think of standardized tests as different. One would say that standardized tests are large-scale examinations, primarily. Okay? You rarely have standardized tests on a small scale. But when you say standardized, usually what you mean is that they're developed by subject matter and assessment specialists. They're usually field tested under uniform administration conditions, and they meet certain criteria, and they are scored and interpreted using uniform procedures. One could therefore say that CCT examinations are standardized exams. Okay? And they are standardized because they fit this criteria. But on a larger scale, things like your GSAT, your GNAT, those exams, they are standardized. Okay? And when Dr. Kerr comes, she's going to speak to you a little bit more about how to set those kinds of examinations, the kinds of systems and resources that are required for those standardized tests. These become very, very critical. In the session today, we are not going to be dealing with high stakes, I should say high stakes, large scale or standardized tests. But we are going to be dealing more so with these classroom assessments, though we will look at the standards that you need to use. You use today certain types of activities, certain types of instruments, certain types of assessment activities. These are the ones that as classroom teachers we are most likely to use and are required to master. These are the ones that are more closely aligned to our day-to-day instruction. These are the ones that are most influential in terms of what the decisions that teachers and students and parents have to make. These are the activities that you must master. These students are going to learn. All right? And I'm saying as well that the classroom assessment activities are primarily for the purpose of formative assessment. And I hope now that sentence makes a lot more sense. Right? Clear? Okay. So it's primarily for formative assessment that we're using classroom assessment, but you recognize that the classroom teacher also has to set summative assessment activities. That's what you perhaps get at the end of a year, in the year examinations. That's summative. And to some extent, the principles that Dr. Kerr will take you through are some of the same principles for, the same principles for large-scale examinations, except that you wouldn't do the piloting and the standardization as you would have in those exams, summative. All right? So they talk about...
Excuse me, Doc.
Yep. Yes, Joseph.
Is it possible that you could share the screen that you're reading from?
You're not seeing the screen?
No, we're not seeing it.
Oh, for goodness sake, are you serious?
I am
All
seeing
this
the
time?
screen, Jocelyn.
I am
I'm
seeing
not
it
seeing it.
as well.
No, I'm not sure the
So what
screen was
happened
really
here?
Jocelyn.
I'm still
I don't know. I don't know, Jocelyn. Try GP.
I'm not seeing internet. I guess I'll.
All right,
Okay.
let me see what I can do for you now. Remember. I'm gonna come out of it and go back in and see what happens, okay? I don't know what else to do. All right, so I'm
Okay.
now going to, I'm now, what are you seeing now?
I am just seeing you.
All right, I'm gonna share again, all right? What are you seeing now?
Yeah, I am seeing it now. Just started seeing it.
All right, okay. Well, the slides
Thank
are
you.
there, so I'm gonna go back now to where I was, which I think is here. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to this slide. Now we're going to talk a bit now about the kinds of assessment activities, because all of these are activities that you will use in your classroom. They can be used for classroom assessment, they can be used for, and I'm going to use two terms, high stakes as well as low stakes. What do I mean by high and low stakes assessment? You didn't have those as one of our terms that we looked at, but you perhaps met them when you were reading. High and low stakes assessment. Is anybody saying? Hazard a guess. We think of high stakes. I'm going to use a sentence and tell me if you can figure it out. Standardized tests are high stakes assessment activities, whereas classroom assessment is usually considered low stakes. What do we mean by high and low stakes? Hazard a guess, somebody. What do you think? Hello. Standardized tests are high-stakes assessment activities, whereas classroom assessment activities tend to be low stakes.
High stakes, maybe your grade is dependent, or whatever is dependent on your grade, so that you can propel to a next level or something like that.
Significant decisions in terms of matriculation, in terms of moving from one group to another group, those decisions are there, and they're considered high stakes because the decisions that are going to be made are high stakes decisions. Okay, whereas low stakes, usually it only matters to few persons, like those that live in the classroom. Okay, and usually classroom assessment is viewed like that. Now, it is traditionally because classroom assessment has been viewed as low stakes, while much attention has not been given to it. But what has happened recently, when I say recently, I mean for the past 20 or so years, the research has pointed to the importance of classroom assessment, and in particular formative assessment, to for the importance of the role that those assessments play in summative high-stakes assessments. And what research has said is that students who perform well under conditions where you have good, sound, solid classroom assessments, those students will do equally well, if not better, on high-stakes assessments. So this notion of going home and do students' homework and for them to do homework and then it's not something that is a figment of one's imagination. The research points to that. All right? So the question then is now, how do we set classroom assessments to ensure that students really do learn and benefit from it? And there are a number of assessment activities types that we want to talk about. We know, for example, the distinction that we have made between alternative, traditional, authentic assessment. Alternative means alternative to traditional assessment, meaning not the kinds that you have, such as the pencil and paper type assessments necessarily, but they require for the person, the teacher, the student, to be engaged in more novel activities. And many times these are authentic in the context in which they are being done. That's the authentic context. So for example, the practicum activity in which you are required to do your micro teaching and teach is authentic assessment, and it is alternative assessment. One could ask you about what you know about teaching, and one could ask you that by asking you to write an essay or to answer some multiple choice questions. But that would not help me to determine if you really can teach. Let's take the driving test. When you do the driving test, for those of you who have done it, you have to do a number of things. You have to do the yard, and you have to do parking, hill start, reverse, and then you also have to go on the road. Okay? And you also have to do the written test, where you have to do your multiple choice test about the road code. Now, if we stop there with the road code, that wouldn't necessarily give us information as to what it is that the new neophyte drivers can do. All right? So, the driving test is alternative to traditional. It's not just the written road code multiple choice test. It is authentic because it is done in context. We don't just keep you in the sterile environment of the yard, but you also have to go on the road, where you have to stop at the stoplight, follow instructions, turn right at the next junction. You come into a junction, you have to make a decision. It's a T-junction, what do I do? It's a four-way junction, what do I do? Those are the decisions you have to take. And also, it is performance because you have to carry out the activity. You have to do it. It involves both process and it involves product. Okay? So all of those are right there. It's performance. It is not portfolio. Why do I say that? Explain myself, it's not a portfolio assessment. But it's performance.
Because
It's
not
authentic.
in any form of portfolio, because it's not necessarily requiring any form of reflection on or writing.
Yes. Any other comment?
Cannot be.
Yes, that's correct, Justin, but I want to see some more on it. And not just in reflection and in writing, but in addition, help him. It's not a portfolio assessment.
I'm not quite sure, but I'm thinking that it's not assessed over a period of time. I'm not too sure about the portfolio assessment.
That's good, actually. I mean, that's a good one. It's not over time. And it might become portfolio. What you could make it a portfolio assessment if in fact you carry it out like that and you monitor. I could do videos of myself parking or myself hill starting, and I have this, collection of videos. Okay? Or I might have a narrative of some form. But you're right, it's not done like that. It's one day usually. You
The
go in and
portfolio will
you-
speak to some documentation.
What's that, Justin?
I'm not saying that portfolio would be more to some level of documentation of process or progress that can be reflected on, or that can be,
Yes,
that can be, presented.
that could work. But can you imagine how long it would take for us to make a decision if persons can drive on the road? We'd have more than a bottleneck. I don't know what we'd have. We'd have a disaster. So that's the whole point. The whole point, it is not portfolio, but for good reasons. Okay? But you have built in the alternative assessment, you have built in the performance assessment, okay? And it is quite authentic. Right? And that then gives you a sort of comprehensive approach that makes it more valid. We talk about validity. Yes, Justin, you're asking a question.
Yeah, in regards to authentic assessment, I am trying to see how best to understand it. Is it in the term, like I'm thinking, let's say you're teaching a topic on, let's say, atom,
Yes.
and you bring the student maybe to a lab where you can actually view these. Would that be what would be authentic?
All right. You could have authentic activities in terms of the exposure that you have for students, the way in which you help them to see what it is that you're saying. So, in your case, for example, you might take them to a lab where they might be able to use different equipment to view atoms or experience the particulate nature of matter in a more hands-on way. That's fine. But in terms of authentic assessment, what you're looking for is that experience, the authentic experience, becomes a part of the assessment itself. So students may be asked to produce, maybe a story about themselves as the atom that was used, one atom that was used to make the metal magnesium, and how it is that the process took place. So instead of just talking about making magnesium, or better still, making iron from extracting iron from its ore,